So I'm going to focus primarily, well, almost exclusively on tin working. So I hope you don't mind that. It'd be lovely to cover so many of the other aspects of extractive landscape, but they've been so well covered already. I felt I could probably allow myself to focus on tin working. So here's an image, 18th century painting by a man who was stimulated, or his imagination was stimulated by seeing this working tin mine more than 200 years ago. Okay, this one, that's it. So here is my start in exploring landscape of extraction. This is 1967, Aylesborough Tin Mine, Sheepstore Parish on southwest Dartmoor. This is the year before Helen Harris's book on the industrial archaeology of Dartmoor was published, and I think the year after Frank Booker's industrial archaeology of Dartmoor Valley was published, or was that 1966? I'm not quite sure. But interestingly, this is only 10 years since the creation of the Society for Medieval Archaeology. And it was still 6 years before the Association of Industrial Archaeology was formed. It was 33 years before the first issue of the journal Landscapes came out, and it was 50 years before the Association of International, or the International Association of Landscape Archaeology was formed in 2017. Interesting. So we've come a long way since 1967, but things were not so good at this time. Sorry, can I point out? Oh, point out the speaker. Oh, well, that's me there. Well, you thought that was me. That's Frank Booker. That's Frank Booker. Frank Booker. That's Colin Kilwington on the right. Some of you will know him. So landscape of extraction was really almost anathema to archaeologists at this period. Industry, extraction, somehow the comfortable middle classes of archaeology couldn't really accept that as being the proper remit of archaeological investigation. They were quite happy with prehistory and only just begun to get happy with medieval features. And here at the site of the Avon Reservoir, which was being constructed in the 1950s, Eileen Fox chose not to excavate this tin blowing mill, but she excavated prehistoric and medieval features, settlement sites very nearby. And in the late 1960s, there was a proposal for a reservoir at Swinkham on Dartmoor. Eileen Fox was employed by the promoters of this reservoir to comment on the archaeology, and she noted Child's Tomb, a medieval cross very similar to this one, which she recommended should be moved. She noted a couple of tinners buildings which she thought should perhaps be investigated, and there were one or two prehistoric things that she noted. But she didn't note that that basin in front of you in that image is full of medieval and later tin works, as several buildings, structures, and so on. This didn't feature in her assessment of that landscape. And particularly, she dismissed Whiteworks tin mine, seen here, just a small detail of it. And I love this thing, find this in Hansard. Diana Woolner, a highly respected amateur archaeologist who made some great discoveries on Dartmoor, prehistoric discoveries. She referred to it, there it is imprinted as a dismal tin mine. And yet it's so beautiful. Look at the beauty in that patterning. And this is just a small part of this mine, which is so full of interest. There's a very early, well, not a very early, there's remains of a stamping mill there of about 1800, which had a lead about 2 miles long, leading to it. And then you can see various shafts, trackways, goodness knows what. And tin was taken from here down to Kellenic near Truro in the late 18th century, which immediately opens up the concept of routes and transport and much else. So where did we begin to actually get a real appreciation of landscape, extractive landscape? And I would say that this could be the starting point of it here, where Francis Griffiths was excavating cairns at Colliford, the site of the Colliford Reservoir, in 1978. And she knew I was interested in tinworking and invited me down to have a look to see if there was anything of interest in the immediate vicinity. So I came down October 1978 and I spotted this stone. I apologize for the quality of the photograph. This had actually been recorded in Cornwall archaeology in 1977, the year before, as a prehistoric cut stone as part of the checklist for Surrey Parish. Whoever recorded it, for some reason, failed to notice that it was actually sitting within a structure, a mill structure, which I obviously was interested in. And this led to the excavation of the West Colliford tin mill. This is how it was in 1979, unexcavated. So there's a tin oakwork here. Francis's cairns are up on the top of the hill there. So with David Austin, he and I were appointed as the directors, and Sandy Gerrard became a very important part of it as well, but we'll come to him in a moment. So this is the tin mill under excavation in its landscape. You can see the tin openwork, which produced the ore that was processed in the mill, stretching away in the background. This is looking at it from the other direction, looking eastwards towards Brongeli. So a substantial excavation in its own right. And here's the mill with the landscape of extraction of the St. Neot River behind. All that is a tin-worked area, and you can see the scarp of where the medieval tinners worked to here in the background. There's another view of the mill under excavation. So this was the first modern excavation of a tin mill in Cornwall, 1978-79. And there's Sandy Gerrard, and this started his interest in tin work. This was the very beginning of his interest. He was a student at Lamorna University, came down and helped David Austin, and it started him off on a huge project, and his research work, PhD and so on studying the tin works of Bodmin Moor and elsewhere. So this is such a key moment in the story of how we slowly began to appreciate landscapes of extraction. Now, this place has been mentioned already today, Crownhill Down tinwork. Now we know we've got these wonderful dates from optically stimulated luminescence, which prove that there were tailings pits, that's sort of waste pits, that were actually in operation from about 200 BC and right up to the up to the 16th century, the range of dates, up to about 1600. But there were mine workings here, there were workings here in the 19th century as well. Now, this is one of the finest, this is really the core example of what is known as an eluvial tinwork. It's a lode working, essentially running east-west, which has been weathered southwards, so the material has been weathered off the top of the lode, and the tinners were able to work it like a streamwork, but they had to bring water to the site, as there was no running water running through it. 1982, to public inquiry, the Inspectorate of Ancient Monuments declared this tin work was worked by man, but was not works of man, as meant in the Ancient Monuments Acts, and so it could not be scheduled. It was not considered archaeology. 1982, Inspectorate of Ancient Monuments. Shameful, so shameful. So we've lost it now. I mean, but £1 million was spent on archaeological work before it was lost. So we have recovered some information. The formation of the Dartmoor Tinworking Research Group in 1991 stimulated interest in recording, surveying some of the landscape features of tinworking on Dartmoor. So this continued for many years, still continues. Plan of Beckermore Combe tinwork there, and the interest in these reservoirs here, which supplied water to the workings themselves. And there's Sandy Gerrard helping with these surveys. So he'd already done a lot of work in Cornwall and was now expanding into other areas. And he is one of the finest field surveyors of our generation, and enormously stimulated interest in extractive landscapes. And the other very fine field worker surveyor is Phil Newman, who has also beautifully recorded many tin working landscapes, mostly on Dartmoor. This is just a detail of one of his fantastic surveys of the Redwater Valley or Vitaver Mine, below the Warren House Inn on Dartmoor. And it's worth noting what working miners thought of this area. So I hope you can read that. The extensive workings at and near Birch Tor are probably the most extraordinary existing. Robert Hunt in 1862. And then tens of millions of tons of stuff must have been taken out of the gullies to get down to water level. I know of no such evidence of ancient mining in any part of Devon and Cornwall as is seen here. These are not insignificant places, and still to be seen, thankfully. Just an example of some of those workings. Here looking across towards Grimspound, just in the picture on the left, top left. And the view looking westwards from Birch Tor over these extraordinary open works that still survive in the landscape, and which so impressed the 19th century miners. Now, when I was preparing this, something struck me that was really important, which I probably hadn't quite fully appreciated. And that is what's unique about our landscape of extraction in Devon and Cornwall, in that every single river and stream running off the granite in either Cornwall or Devon has been worked for tin. Every single stream. Now, there's no other part of Britain where you've got an industrial landscape that encompasses every single watercourse coming off an area. I don't think so, unless someone can correct me about that. But this makes our landscapes of extraction so important, so significant, because it connects places quite a long way off some of the granite back onto the granite uplands. And there's a human story of working all these streams. So this is the Dartmoor map with the Stannery towns marked as well, and also, of course, the great, wonderful central point where the Tinners held their great courts, where they enacted statutes, which is documented from 1474 on Dartmoor. So the streamworks of Dartmoor are quite extraordinary. Here is an aerial view of Dry Lake streamwork, which is actually documented in 1240. The feature, this feature Dry Lake here, but the mine was working, the last period of working was about 1920 of this mine, and you can actually see here, you can see a neat embankment, a water wheel pit for a huge pumping wheel, and a dressing floor of the late 19th and early 20th century mine as well. But that's Dry Lake, 1240, and this is what it looks like as a landscape, in the landscape. Absolutely extraordinary scale of working. And this is a very beautiful image taken by Neil Mercer, who is going to publish a phenomenal book called Spirit of Dartmoor Tin on the 4th of February next year. So look out for that. This is Sker, which is a tributary of the River Dart, but it's got wonderful streamworks, and I'm sure you can see, even from where you are, that there are many different type patterns here in the landscape, these long ridges, but look at these little ones here and over here. So there are sort of isolated early streamworks at a higher level that have then been cut through or reworked at a later time. And gold has also been found at this location too. Here is a view of very systematic working of medieval streamworks, where medieval pottery has been found in among these, high up on Dartmoor, on southern Dartmoor, and really impressive and exciting place to be. Just the physical experience of either climbing around or through these channels over the heather. In this instance, this is on northern Dartmoor, and it's a visceral experience which sort of connects us perhaps to the hard work of the tinners themselves. And here at Colliford Reservoir, when it's drawn down, is the site of a tin mill, very difficult to see, but in the foreground there is a tin blowing mill ruins, but in the middle distance you can see the heaps of the tin streamworks. But Dartmoor has, as I illustrated at the Vitaver mine, has these extraordinary open works as well. And one of the most impressive areas on the southern Dartmoor is here at Ringle Shoots on Holm Moor, where probably a team, we know a team of, seemed to be a team of 19 adventurers from the parish of Holm were working it in the late 15th century, or working in this area. This is an extraordinarily impressive place. The open work for the tinners used water in a most extraordinary way. They were masters at manipulating water, storing water in reservoirs, and then using that water to sluice out the waste material, the lighter waste from their workings, or to power mills and so on. So that's just one of the many reservoirs. And this is a schematic plan of part of Holme Moor here, where these blues, these are all the open works of ringle shoots that I was showing you. There are interesting leaps, some of which are tinworking, to do with tinworking, not all of them. And then there's the green of the streamworks in the area. So it's just an extraordinary landscape of extraction, which is just as much part of our medieval heritage as medieval longhouses and field systems, or prehistoric settlement sites and field systems. But there's a hidden landscape as well. So in this image, hope you can see that in section, see that dark matter there, and here, those are two leats feeding into the open work, which you can't actually really see on the surface. There's a slight depression there, but you'd be hard put to follow that leat back any further. So these places are absolutely full of the most amazing information, which we have not yet begun to explore, essentially. And look at these beautiful places as they are now, vegetated and quiet, but dramatic. On the left there's a whim platform, which is a platform on which a horse worked round and round, a capstan-like structure to enable ropes to be sent down the shaft in the foreground for hauling up buckets of ore. And another very fine open work here on southwest Dartmoor, known as Willoughby, documented in the late medieval and late medieval period and a bit later. And here's a fine aerial view of Hexworthy Mine, which has some medieval elements to it. This gully, for example, this is a medieval open work, but it's had shafts, had a great shaft sunk there and other shafts along it. There's an added entrance here you can't see very clearly. There's a wheel pit there. These wonderful fingertips leading out from this shaft, where in the late 19th, early 20th century, there was a tramway leading out, and then there's an early 20th century dressing floor there. Or that is what was known as an engine house. It had various engines in it. It's not a Cornish engine house, but had electrically driven engines in it. But I suppose really what and I can also show that's a medieval reservoir there with the leat leading into the open work. So that's typical, so typical of any Dartmoor site. And it's just so varied, so diverse, so expensive. It's wondrous. And here's a site not well known by people, Omen Beam or Homing Beam, north of Princetown. It's because it's within enclosed land north of Princetown, but very important open work in its own right, where 15th century pottery has been found. And of course, what was produced in these streamworks and these open works then had to be processed in mills. This is a mill in its landscape on the River Avon, which we have documentary evidence, of it being built as a clash mill in 1599, which is rather nice. I hope you can see the structure there. It's a stamping mill, essentially. And here is the earliest documented tin blowing mill, which has structural features still surviving in the landscape. 1457, this was operating as a tin blowing mill, that is smelting tin. The site is here. That's the furnace site there. There was probably a wheel pit somewhere here. You can just see a leak coming in at that level. It seemed to have gone to a reservoir, which was then tapped and brought water to the mill. 1457, Fair Combe. And the excavation site that I was involved with on Western Dartmoor in the 1990s, Upper Merivale Mill here, where tin was smelted and crushed and smelted. So the furnace structure here, a buddle, a sort of bellows platform here, a channel leading out to dressing areas here, and the mold stone for producing the ingots of tin still in situ by the doorway. Well, that's all pretty good, isn't it? So not bad. But things are not good now. I think our cultural heritage and our cultural landscape is at more of this now than it's ever been. Well, certainly in my lifetime. There are voices and fashionable activities at work which threaten cultural heritage. So I've put up here some quotes from this year in national newspapers. George Monbiot, Dartmoor is sheep-wrecked, an ecological disaster zone among the most mistreated ecosystems in Europe. Ben Goldsmith, Dartmoor is grazed to death, utterly desolate, barren, largely devoid of wildflowers, birdsong, or much wildlife at all. And then this group 30 Greeves that and so on. Dartmoor is dying. Well, it's absolute nonsense, and yet there it is in print in national newspapers. These are re-wetters, climate change activists. None of those things do I necessarily have an issue with, except when they articulate it in these words. They are so ignorant, it's unbelievable. And none of them mention the cultural landscape. We have failed as a group, collectively, as people interested in the archaeology of our land, to get across that the land contains culture equally with nature. The two should be absolutely in balance. I could stop there, but I won't quite. How long have I got? 10 minutes, yeah, fine, yeah, that's right. So this is a view of Golden Dagger, the Redwater Valley, below where Phil Newman had his wonderful survey, did his wonderful survey. And it's quite an interesting image, really, because we've got forestry activity. We haven't talked about timber extraction, I don't think, today. And then in the center of the valley is what was a massive medieval and later tin stream work. And then on the right, of course, we've got medieval agriculture, the wonderful Chaku. So today, as you can see, there's a very healthy growth of trees in the valley, which have grown up in the last years, or mostly the last 30 years. And it makes it very different in terms of interpretation and investigation and trying to understand what actually went on. So that's from the same valley. That's what was happening in the 1920s. And all these features, for which subtle and sometimes not so subtle remains survive, are being obscured by that vegetation. Does that matter? Well, we'll have to discuss that at length this afternoon and go home at midnight. And there's there's a picture I took of the mine house 1971, with a conifer plantation behind it, which is completely gone now. It's completely gone. Because all the trees were felled. That is now reverting to moorland vegetation, scrub and willows and birch and so on, sort of hardwood trees. And this is a view, oops, nearly pressed the wrong one. So this is more or less, this is looking the other way, looking into Syson's plantation, which still has conifers within it. But you can see that there's been huge change. And this is only in well, mostly 30 years, but certainly within 50 years. And imagine what change there'll be in the next 50 years, if only the voices of those people that I listed are heard. Our voices, our cultural voices, desperately need hearing. And look, there are people playing games on Dartmoor, all sorts of games, spending millions of pounds on utterly useless projects. This is one of theirs where they've started attacking tinworks because they perceive them as drainage channels threatening lowland communities, increasing the likelihood of floodwater and so on, running off and so on. So they've decided to block some of these tinwork medieval gullies, but without proper pause and thinking about what these places actually mean or could mean to society for its well-being. And I show this illustration. It's a reservoir at nearly 1,700 feet, Tinner's Reservoir, 1,700 feet on southern Dartmoor, near the highest point on southern Dartmoor, which is Riders Hill. And it could only have been used for collecting rainwater runoff in a closely grazed environment. And that's what makes Dartmoor so special as a grazed environment used by all sorts of people. I mean, one could illustrate prehistoric examples as well of you had to have a grazed environment in order to see the small stone roads that Peter was mentioning and so on. But it's all changing on Dartmoor because of the policies of natural England, I'm sorry to say. But not a complete pessimist. Bill Horner drew attention to the fact that many of the streams running off Dartmoor, pockets of woodland on the edge of Dartmoor, beyond the edge of Dartmoor, contain tinworks and other industrial sites. And most of these Dartmoor woodlands are what I would call more or less woodland pasture. They're not necessarily the classic woodland pasture, closely grazed with a lot of grazing animals, but they're usually accessible and you can see things within them. So this is near Mary Tavy, and you could say, well, yeah, there are trees here, but you can actually work out what the pattern of the industrial activity was. So I'm quite a fan of wood pasture. You are too. So here's a site that is not really woodland, but it's got some trees in it. It's a large, very large tin openwork, southwest Dartmoor, but is still grazed by sheep and cattle and ponies, and so you've got access to see it. Now, this is my only deviation from tin working, I think. I just wanted to emphasize that our woods are full of wonders. To do with extractive industry. It's just a zigzag path that the charcoal boat would have in the Dart Valley, but of course needed paths and whatever. So they're not isolated elements in the landscape. Cornwall. Oh, my goodness. Cornwall, West Penwith of the southwest peninsula, West Penwith Moors included, contains evidence of medieval and possibly sometimes later tinworking. But in West Penwith, this is what you're confronted with. Impenetrable. It's not wood. It's completely impenetrable in most cases, not absolutely in every case, but is such an important part of the landscape of this part of Cornwall. And here, wonderful, we saw it in one of Ainsley's photographs, I think, an aerial view from Greenborough Engine House looking towards Galva. But this is the head of the Newman River, and it's full of medieval tinworks. Very, very difficult to see, but all this area is tinworked that you can see in this image. So, but it needs management. Now, a couple of months, was it now? You may have heard of it. Natural England held a town meeting in St. Ives, Board of Natural England. Whether to designate triple S site of special listening to objective promotes their staff was heard. That was from a parish councillor from Tywednack, who just happened in passing to talk of archaeology. Otherwise, the cultural element of this wondrous landscape was completely omitted, which again I think is utterly shameful and shows how out of touch our legislation and the criteria for designating landscape is at the moment. Just needs complete revision because we now know so much more. We didn't in the 50s and 60s, as I hope I showed, or the attitudes were against such things. But now we know better. And I'm afraid legislation and designation hasn't, excuse me, hasn't caught up with this yet. Getting close, that's good. So am I. So, yes, I just photographed the Porthmeor Valley, full of tinworks, but rather tricky to see. And as having tinworks, Pete mentioned it. This, a great haven of artists, completely unaware that this is one of the finest surviving medieval tinworks in West Cornwall. It's colossal, all the way down the Lamorna Valley. I don't know how many miles we've got because it runs all the way back right up onto the Penwith Moors, its various tributaries. But from the road junction down to the valley, there's this incredible tinwork that was documented in the 14th century. There was a big dispute over water, and there are scarps 20, 30 feet high and huge mounds of tinworking spoil. There are buildings have recently been discovered within it. As far as I know, it's not recorded at all yet, but it should be considered one of the wonders of West Cornwall. And this is just to emphasize why we are interested. I know you're all interested, but the wonders of it and how we can restore memory to places. This is a view down the Redwater Valley where Phil Newman did his survey, looking down towards Golden Dagger. Look particularly at this mound here, there in this pathway here, and this is how it looked in August 1863. That's the very same pathway, the very same mound, and there it is, peopled with miners. Astonishing image, 1863, 106 years ago. But for me, this is why I'm interested in archaeology, and I'm sure many of you are for the same reason. We want to re-people the landscape. We want to restore memory. We want to excite people about how other people have lived and worked. So that's hopefully a good example. Just 2 slides left. So here is an example way down the Walkham Valley where it meets the River Tavy. It's an example, in my view, of culture and nature in balance. There are mature oak trees growing on the top of medieval tinworks, which you can still see, but there's ground cover that is raised by livestock. This is woodland pasture. This is good. Such sites are too important for the well-being of society, natural England, to be the only arbiters of how they are managed. A cultural voice is needed urgently. We have to do it somehow. And I just end, as I started with a painting 200 years ago by John Sweet, and here's one 200 years later of one of the last tinworking episodes on the fringes of Dartmoor near Ashburton in 1972, but stimulating the imagination of an artist in this example. So thank you very much.